Monday morning in Manhattan opened with cold rain against the bronze doors of the federal courthouse, and inside, the wide marble lobby filled with the controlled noise of cameras, microphones, and footsteps that all leaned toward one woman. Serafina Blake walked through the metal detector with her shoulders square, her dark hair pulled back, her charcoal suit pressed but slightly damp at the cuffs. She did not look at the press. She had read what they had been calling her for 3 weeks. The thief of the energy industry. The fake genius. The young woman who had built a company on stolen blueprints. None of it was true, but truth had stopped mattering somewhere between the first headline and the federal indictment. Inside the fourth courtroom, the gallery was already full. The case had been positioned by the press as the largest clean energy theft of the decade, and the seats were packed with journalists, industry analysts, and a row of men in expensive suits who did not introduce themselves to anyone. Serafina recognized them anyway. They worked for Nexus Grid Corporation, the company that had spent the last 6 months trying to break her. Her legal team waited at the defense table. 4 attorneys from one of the most respected firms in the country, all of whom had assured her the night before that they were ready. The lead counsel, a tall man who had charged her $300,000 in retainer alone, did not meet her eyes when she sat down. He whispered to the second chair. The second chair whispered to the paralegal. The paralegal closed a binder and slid it back into the rolling case. Then the lead counsel stood and asked the court for permission to withdraw. Serafina turned her head so slowly that the motion looked frozen. She heard him say the words conflict of interest newly discovered. She heard him say that his firm could no longer represent her. She heard him say that he was very sorry. Behind him, the other 3 lawyers were already standing, already gathering their things, already preparing to leave her alone in front of the most public courtroom of her life. Judge Hilda Barrett asked twice whether the defendant had replacement counsel. Serafina did not answer the first time because she could not. She did not answer the second time because she finally understood what had happened. Someone had reached her firm. Someone had applied the kind of pressure that money could no longer refuse. The prosecutor, Clinton Avery, rose with practiced calm and asked the court to proceed without delay, citing the gravity of the charges and the readiness of the government's case. At the back of the courtroom, a man in a janitor's uniform set down his mop.I. His name tag read Finn Walker.id. He had been listening since the first whispered exchange at the defense table. He had also been looking briefly at the exhibit list left open by the lead counsel, and one detail had stopped him cold. The Bates numbering on the documents skipped. Pages were missing. Judge Barrett asked one more time, "Miss Blake, do you have anyone to represent you in this matter?" Serafina did not answer. Finn Walker stepped forward. He said, very quietly, that he could. The courtroom froze for half a second, then broke into noise. A bailiff began moving toward him. Clinton Avery laughed once, sharp and cold, and asked the court if it now permitted maintenance staff to interrupt federal proceedings. Finn did not flinch. He gave the clerk his bar number, his date of admission to the federal court, and asked her to verify that his license was active. Judge Barrett called a brief recess. 12 minutes later the clerk returned and confirmed it. Finn Walker had never been disbarred. He had simply stopped practicing. Serafina stared at him. Finn lowered his voice. If she wanted any chance of surviving this morning, he told her, she should not say another word until she had counsel. She nodded. The judge granted a continuance until the afternoon to allow Finn to review the case. Nexus had not planned for this. They had counted on her standing alone. Finn led Serafina into a small preparation room down the hall, where the lighting was flat and the air smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. She set her bag on the table and studied him for a long moment before she spoke. She asked whether he was actually a lawyer. He answered without performing. He had practiced. His license was current. His reputation was not. He told her briefly that he had once been a commercial litigation attorney in New York. He had handled contracts, patents, trade secrets, and corporate fraud. 3 years earlier, he had been pulled into an internal scandal involving leaked documents. The actual wrongdoer was a senior partner. Finn had been the convenient one to blame. He was never charged, never disbarred, but the rumor had been enough. The big firm stopped calling. Around the same time, his wife had died in a car accident, and he had a small daughter to raise. He had taken a night janitorial position at the federal courthouse because the hours allowed him to be home in the morning. The benefits covered her pediatrician, and the work let him be near the only profession he still respected, even from a distance. Serafina listened without interrupting. He asked about her legal team. She told him that they had been on this case for 6 months and had been confident the night before. He nodded and said the withdrawal had not been spontaneous. Someone had pressured them, and that pressure had only one likely source. Then he turned to the exhibit list. He did not skim. He examined the order, the dates, the senders, the recipients, the chain of custody, what was original and what was a copy. Within the first hour, he had 3 observations. The Bates numbers had a gap, which meant pages had been pulled before production. The witness statement of a former assistant named Andrea Sloan used legal phrasing that no frightened employee would write on her own. The expert report by a Dr. George Kessler ended with a striking percentage, but had a methodology section that would not survive a serious questioning. When the afternoon recess ended and the judge agreed to push the substantive hearing to the next morning, Finn excused himself briefly. Serafina followed him out by accident on her way to the restroom and saw him in the staff hallway, kneeling on one knee, retying the laces of a small girl's sneaker. The child held a worn rabbit in the crook of her arm and watched him as if no one else in the world existed. Serafina heard the girl ask why so many people had been looking at her father in such a strange way. He smiled, very tired, and said that he had done something a little surprising. The girl handed him a folded square of notebook paper. On it, in pencil, in the careful handwriting of a child of 6, were 4 words. "Daddy tells the truth." Finn put the note in his pocket. He did not see Serafina watching from the corner. She turned and walked the other way, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she felt as if she might not be alone. That evening, in the same preparation room, Finn told her his condition for taking the case. She had to tell him everything, even the things that made her look bad. Even the things she had not told her previous lawyers. In a federal courtroom, half the truth was enough to hang her. She agreed. That night, in a small rented office 2 blocks from the courthouse, the work began in earnest. The coffee on the burner had been there too long. The copier ran in steady rhythm in the corner. Outside the window, Manhattan kept its lights on. Serafina explained her technology in plain language because Finn asked her to. Her company, Blake Quantum Systems, had developed a grid stabilization platform that used a quantum-inspired simulation model to predict overload, balance demand across a transmission network, and reduce loss in the lines that carried power into large cities. It was not a miracle. It was an extremely sophisticated optimization layer. Done right, it could save a metropolitan utility billions of dollars over a decade and weaken the dependence of municipalities on a small number of legacy infrastructure suppliers. Nexus Grid Corporation was one of those suppliers. They had offered to acquire her company 18 months earlier at a price she considered insulting. When she refused, the lawsuits began, the investor pressure followed, and the rumor of stolen technology began to circulate in industry circles, like a leak no one had bothered to identify. Finn asked about Andrea Sloan. Serafina explained that Andrea had been her executive assistant for almost 3 years. Andrea was not an engineer. She had access to scheduling, contracts, and certain strategy documents, but she had never been near the core mathematics of the platform. 6 months earlier, Andrea had abruptly resigned. Within weeks, her name had appeared in the federal complaint as the cooperating witness. Serafina had been certain Andrea had betrayed her. Finn was less certain. Real betrayers, he said, tended to disappear into the background. Andrea had been placed at the center of the case like a piece arranged on a board. He noticed that Nexus claimed its proprietary information had been compromised in April, but Serafina had filed her provisional patent description in February. If she could document the existence of her invention before Nexus claimed any loss, the theft narrative weakened. He turned to the Kessler report. The doctor had concluded that the two systems were 92% similar, but he never explained how he defined similar. Finn marked the margin with a single phrase. A pretty number for the press, an ugly number for science. He read Andrea's statement next. He paused at one sentence. I am fully aware that the conduct of Blake Systems constitutes the misappropriation of trade secrets. He said quietly that frightened executive assistants did not phrase things that way. Lawyers did. Near midnight, he found a printed email in the file with most of the metadata redacted. The sender was hidden, the recipient was partial, but a fragment of a server header at the bottom remained legible. The prefix did not belong to Serafina's company. It belonged to a corporate mail server that had appeared elsewhere in the Nexus exhibits. Serafina asked him what that meant. He said it meant that some of the messages being used to prove she had stolen something had likely been generated, forwarded, or altered through the very company accusing her. He asked her for full access to her email backups, her server logs, and the access history on Andrea's old account. She hesitated. That data was the most sensitive material her company owned. He looked at her without softening it. He told her that if she kept secrets from him, Nexus would use those secrets to convict her. She gave him the credentials. By morning, the news had spread. The story of the abandoned chief executive and the janitor who had stepped forward had crossed every news desk on the East Coast. Some of the coverage was sympathetic. Most of it was not. The phrases ran easily. Janitor lawyer. The man with the mop died. The strangest defense in a generation. The gallery the next day was even fuller. Many of the people in the back rows had come to watch Serafina Blake lose in spectacular fashion. Clinton Avery began with confidence. He described Serafina as brilliant but ambitious. A young executive who had decided that she could not catch Nexus through legitimate competition and had used her assistant to steal what she could not invent. He told the jury that the case was not about innovation. It was about greed dressed as genius. Serafina sat very still. Finn slid a small piece of paper across the defense table. On it he had written 4 words. Do not react yet. When his turn came, Finn stood up in a borrowed suit that did not quite fit at the shoulders. The gallery let out a small sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite a murmur. Finn waited until the room was quiet. Then he spoke. He told the jury that the prosecution would show them many charts. Nexus would show them many numbers. But this case, he said, would not be decided by the thickness of any binder. It would be decided by 3 questions. Where did the documents come from? Who benefited when they appeared? And why had the most important pages gone missing? The room shifted. Some of the laughter faded. The prosecution called Dr. George Kessler. He took the stand with the practiced ease of a man who had testified many times before and had been paid very well for it. He explained that the architecture of Blake Quantum's platform was 92% similar to the architecture of certain Nexus internal designs. He used technical vocabulary and dense layers, and the jurors began to look as if they were drowning. Finn rose for cross-examination. He did not start with money. He started with credentials. Dr. Kessler held a doctorate in applied physics. He had published papers on mathematical modeling. He had never directly operated a metropolitan grid stabilization system. Finn asked whether he had ever deployed any production-grade load balancing platform in a working utility. The doctor began to qualify his answer. Finn asked again, more simply. The doctor said that he had not. Finn asked him to define the 92% similarity. The doctor said it was the result of an algorithmic comparison. Finn asked him to point to the comparison algorithm in the report. The doctor turned pages. The conclusion was there. The methodology was not. Then Finn produced an invoice. The invoice showed that Dr. Kessler had received $300,000 from a consulting entity 2 weeks before he had submitted his report. Clinton Avery objected. Finn explained, calmly, that the document was already in the discovery file, simply buried in a financial appendix the prosecution had failed to bring to the attention of the court. Judge Barrett allowed the question to proceed. Finn looked at the witness for a long, still moment. He asked, "Were you paid to find the truth, or were you paid to produce a number large enough to frighten people about Miss Blake?" The doctor did not answer immediately. The silence in the courtroom lasted 6 seconds. 6 seconds was long enough to crack a story open. In the back row, Leon Granger stood up and walked out. Serafina expected reporters in the lobby. She did not expect what waited in the parking garage. Finn led her down the freight stairwell instead of the front steps. Old instincts returned quickly. The garage on the second underground level was almost empty. 2 black sedans were parked side by side near the elevator. Leon Granger leaned against the front fender of the closer one, alone, a coffee cup in one hand and an unhurried smile on his face. He greeted Finn by name. He congratulated him on what he called an entertaining performance. He suggested that Finn consider stopping while the show was still amusing. Finn asked him what he meant by stopping. Leon's smile did not change. He said that Louisa Walker was a sweet girl. He said the after-school program at her elementary school in Queens was a good one. He named the woman who picked her up from school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He said it as if he were discussing the weather. Serafina felt the air leave her chest. Finn did not raise his voice. He did not move. He took his phone from the inside pocket of his suit and turned the screen toward Leon. The audio recorder was running. The timestamp was visible. Every word of the encounter had been captured. Leon's smile finally cracked. He said that a recording in a parking garage was not enough to do anything to him. Finn agreed. Alone, he said, it was not. Combined with a break-in, with a paid expert witness, with a coerced cooperating witness, and with a coordinated withdrawal of opposing counsel, it became something different. Leon said nothing. Finn said one more thing. "The first time men like you tried to bury a man with leaked documents, I made the mistake of believing you would stop when you got caught. I am not making that mistake again." Leon walked back to his sedan and drove away. That night, Finn drove Louisa to a friend's house in New Jersey. The friend was a former colleague from the firm who had stayed loyal through the scandal. Louisa carried her overnight bag in one hand and the rabbit in the other. She did not cry. She knew her father well enough to know when something was wrong, even when he tried to make his voice ordinary. She asked him whether he was in trouble. He did not lie to her. He said that he was helping a woman who had been blamed for something she did not do, and that some bad people did not like it. The girl was quiet for a moment. Then she asked whether he was going to stop. He took longer to answer than he expected. He told her that he was afraid. He said that being afraid was not nothing. But if he stopped because he was afraid, the next time those people would do the same thing to someone else, and that other person might not have anyone to step forward. She thought about this in the slow, careful way that small children think about important things. She said okay. She hugged him. He held her longer than he intended. Then he drove back to Manhattan, alone in a quiet car, and somewhere on the bridge he made the decision he had not yet admitted he was making. He was no longer trying to win one case. He was finishing something he had let go of 3 years before. The next evening, Finn and Serafina entered the offices of Blake Quantum Systems. The space had been ambitious once. Now half the desks were empty. A whiteboard in the back conference room still carried equations that had not been erased in months. A photograph of the founding team gathered dust on a shelf. Serafina logged into the company's internal server, the email backup archive, and the access history records. Finn did not break into anything. He worked only with credentials granted by the rightful owner of the company. He was very precise about that line. They examined Andrea Sloane's account first. In the weeks before her resignation, Andrea had repeatedly opened folders titled External Legal Risk and Nexus Acquisition Talks. On a quick read, this looked damning. Finn did not stop at the first read. He cross-referenced the timestamps of those folder accesses with the calendar history Serafina still had for Andrea's personal life. 3 of the access events occurred during hours when Andrea was scheduled at the hospital with her father. Either someone else had used her credentials, or someone else had access to her account. Serafina remembered suddenly that Andrea had reported a stolen company laptop a week before resigning. The incident had been logged as a minor inconvenience. Finn went deeper. In Andrea's old mailbox, he found 3 messages addressed to Serafina that had been routed into a hidden filter and never delivered. The messages were short and panicked. "I think they are using my name. Do not trust the affidavit when it appears. I'm sorry. They know about my father." Serafina sat down slowly. She had been certain for 6 months that the woman who had once been her closest colleague had betrayed her. She had been wrong. Andrea had tried to warn her. Finn pulled the contract Nexus had quietly signed with Andrea after her resignation. The non-compete clause was almost industry-wide. The penalty clause for any disclosure of what was called the family assistance arrangement was crushing. Finn understood. Nexus had not hired Andrea. They had bought her silence with the medical bills of a sick man. Late that night, a message arrived at the office's main line from an unfamiliar number. "I do not want to keep lying. They are watching me." Serafina read it twice. The cadence of the sentences was Andreas. Finn replied with one line. "Do not send anything else. Tell me only a safe place to meet." A few minutes later, an address came through. A small commuter rail platform, 2 stations outside the city. They left immediately. When they arrived, the platform was nearly empty. The bench Andrea had described was empty as well. There was a folded scarf on the seat. In the trash bin a few feet away, a small phone had been smashed and left on top of a discarded coffee cup. Finn did not touch any of it. He photographed everything from where he stood. Serafina whispered that they had gotten to her first. Finn shook his head slowly. If Nexus had wanted to truly silence her, he said, they would not have left a phone behind in plain sight. They wanted her frightened, not vanished. Frightened witnesses sometimes recanted. Vanished ones became investigations. He called the police anyway, anonymously, to report the broken phone, and then he and Serafina drove back into the city in the long quiet of an empty highway. Around midnight, Finn returned to his apartment in Queens to gather a change of clothes for himself, a few of Louisa's favorite books, and a copy of a handwritten notebook he kept in a drawer beneath the bed. The notebook held 3 years of careful notes on the case that had ended his career. He had never thrown it away. He had never read it again either. The hallway was quiet when he reached his door. Then he saw the lock. The brass was scratched in the unmistakable pattern of a forced entry tool. He did not push the door. He stepped backward. From inside he could hear movement. 2 voices, low, careful. He did not pretend to be a man who could fight 3 intruders. He pulled the fire alarm at the end of the hallway, called 911 as he walked toward the stairwell, and began knocking on the doors of his neighbors so that the corridor would not be empty when the men came out. 3 men came out fast. One of them lunged for his bag because his bag held a backup copy of the most important parts of the case file. They struggled briefly on the landing. Finn was hit hard across the face, but kept his grip. He pushed the bag through the partly open door of the elderly woman across the hall and shouted at her to lock it. She did. 2 of the men ran. What? The third, slower, was caught by the responding officers in the lobby. In his coat, the police found photographs of Louisa, printed schedule of Finn's daily routines and a list of documents that he had been carrying in his work briefcase. Serafina arrived 20 minutes later. The apartment behind Finn was a mess. Louisa's books were scattered on the floor. The duplicate stuffed rabbit, the one Louisa kept for nights at home, had been thrown into a corner. Serafina stood in the doorway and saw, very clearly, that the cost of this case had moved past money and reputation into something she could not undo. She apologized. She told Finn that he owed her nothing, that he could walk away, that she would understand if he did. He was holding a piece of gauze against his lip. He looked at her, calm and tired, and said that he was not doing this because she was wealthy or famous. He was doing it because Nexus believed they had the right to do this to anyone they chose, and someone had to make that belief expensive. His phone rang. Andrea Dea. Her voice was shaking. She was hidden in a small motel 2 hours upstate. She had been afraid to use a phone for almost a full day. She told Finn that the men sent for her had not caught her because she had run earlier than they expected. She had a recording. In it, Leon Granger discussed paying the consultant, coordinating with the firm representing Serafina, and shaping the witness statements. She was willing to give it up. She was not willing to die for it. Finn did not tell her to come to the city. He told her to stay exactly where she was. He hung up. Then, he called Special Agent Irene Chandler of the New York field office of the Bureau. She had known him during the old scandal. She had always believed the scandal had been engineered. When Finn told her what he had, she stopped him in the middle of the second sentence and said, quietly, that she was already on her way. The next morning the prosecution moved quickly. Clinton Avery requested permission to use Andrea Sloane's prior written affidavit because the witness, he said, was unavailable. If granted, the document would do most of the work of convicting Serafina without anyone present to challenge it. Finn rose to object. He told the court that the right of the defendant to confront witnesses could not be set aside when the witness had become unavailable under circumstances suggesting intimidation. He laid 3 facts before Judge Barrett: the threat in the parking garage on the record, the break-in at his apartment, with the photographs of his daughter recovered from a captured intruder, the undisclosed payments to the prosecution's expert witness from a consulting entity tied to Nexus. Clinton Avery argued with rising volume that the defense was attempting to convert a federal trial into a conspiracy theory. Finn did not raise his voice. He said that 1 coincidence could be an accident. 3 coincidences, all favorable to the same private corporation, deserved examination. Judge Barrett asked Clinton, plainly, why his office had not personally verified the circumstances surrounding the affidavit of the cooperating witness. Clinton began to answer, and the answer began to tangle. He had relied on the documents Nexus had provided. He had accepted the chain of communication offered by their counsel. He had not checked. It was the moment in which the prosecutor stopped looking like the government and started looking like the unwitting tool of it. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Special Agent Irene Chandler walked in first. Behind her came Andrea Sloane, pale, smaller than her photographs, her arms wrapped around her own elbows. 2 other agents flanked her. The gallery made one collective sound, sharp and surprised, and then went silent. Serafina almost stood. Finn placed one hand quietly on the table. She remained seated. The judge admitted Andrea as a witness with appropriate protective measures. Finn questioned her gently. He did not lead her into a story. He let her tell it. She said that her father had been diagnosed with a kidney condition that required ongoing dialysis. Her family had run out of money and out of options. A man from Nexus had appeared at her door with what he described as an opportunity through a private medical foundation. The bills were paid. The foundation was a shell. When she tried to refuse what came next, the people who had paid the bills explained, gently, that those payments could be reclassified as evidence of fraud and that her father's coverage could be discontinued. They handed her an affidavit already drafted. They waited while she signed. She had tried to write to Serafina. The emails had been blocked. When Finn asked her if she was afraid of being killed, she said yes. When he asked her why she had come, she said that she had spent 6 months unable to look at her own daughter, and that one more day of silence was no longer possible. Then she handed over the recording. In a calm conference room voice, Leon Granger could be heard saying that the goal had never been to prove Serafina Blake had stolen anything. The goal was to bury her before the technology could be commercially licensed. Clinton Avery sat down. Dr. Kessler, in the gallery, lowered his head into his hands. Leon Granger stood and turned toward the rear doors and was met there, calmly, by 2 agents who had been standing in his way the entire time. Judge Barrett ordered a recess and sealed portions of the record that day. By the next morning, the headlines had reversed. The day before, Serafina Blake had been the alleged thief of the energy industry. The day after, the question on every front page was different. How had Nexus Grid Corporation manipulated a federal proceeding into a public execution? The Bureau executed search warrants at the Nexus corporate headquarters and at the homes of 3 senior executives. They found internal emails describing the strategy of forcing what Leon called the Blake team to lose representation before trial in order to coerce a settlement. They found wire transfers routed through a consulting shell to Dr. Kessler. They found a media plan for the campaign of articles that had been written about Serafina, with line items and dollar amounts attached to specific publications. Clinton Avery was placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. He had not been the architect of the conspiracy, but he had built his case on a foundation he had never tested, and he would carry that mistake for the rest of his career. Some lessons are not for the guilty. Some lessons are for the proud. Judge Barrett dismissed the principal charges against Serafina Blake when the prosecution proved unable to defend the integrity of its own evidence. The civil suit by Nexus was stayed pending the criminal inquiry. Within the week, the company's general counsel had resigned, 2 board members had stepped down, and a major federal contract had been suspended. Serafina walked out of the courthouse without smiling. The press tried to feed her the line they expected her to deliver. The story of her vindication. The story of her revenge. She did not give it to them. She told them simply that the person who had saved her was not an expensive legal team. He was not a famous public relations consultant. He was a single father whom every person in that courtroom had treated as if he were not there. The line traveled. The public, which had spent weeks consuming the story of the brilliant young woman who had supposedly stolen her own success, now turned to the story of the man with the mop. People began to ask who Finn Walker was. Reporters dug into the old scandal. Some of them did the work properly. They began to find what had been hidden 3 years earlier. The leaked documents had not come from him. They had come from a senior partner who had needed a younger man to take the fall. The same firm had quietly written the man a settlement and quietly let him keep his license, hoping the silence would hold. The silence did not hold. Finn did not give interviews. He took 2 days off to be with Louisa. He took her to a small park near the river and let her run. She asked him at one point whether he was famous now. He told her he was not, and that being famous was not what he had wanted. She asked what he had wanted. He thought about it for a long time. He said he had wanted her to grow up in a world in which truth was still possible. She nodded the way small children nod when they understand something they cannot yet put into words. By the time he returned to the courthouse to resume his shift the next week, he had already received a formal request from the Bureau and from the United States Attorney's Office. They wanted his testimony in the criminal proceeding that was forming against Leon Granger and the senior leadership of Nexus. He agreed. Several months later, the criminal trial of Leon Granger and 4 senior executives of Nexus Grid Corporation began in the same courthouse in which Serafina Blake had once been left alone. The roles had reversed. Serafina was no longer a defendant. She was a victim, and a witness. Andrea Sloan, under the protection of the Bureau, was the cooperating witness. Finn Walker was the man whose testimony anchored the entire chain of events. The defense lawyers for Nexus were experienced and well paid. They tried to break Finn first. They asked why a talented attorney had been working as a janitor. They reopened the old scandal. They tried to convince the jury that he had taken the Blake case to rebuild his own reputation, and that he could not be trusted as a neutral witness. Finn did not deflect. He acknowledged that he had lost his career. He acknowledged that he had lost friends, that he had lost the life he had imagined, and that for 3 years he had chosen silence in order to feed his daughter and pay her doctor and be present in her life. He said that the cleaning shift at the courthouse had given him steady work, regular hours, and the ability to be home in the morning when she woke up. He said that none of it was a confession of guilt. It was the price he had been willing to pay until the moment he was no longer willing to pay it. The defense lawyer pressed harder. He asked the jury to believe that a janitor had seen what an entire prosecution team had missed. Finn looked at him for a moment without anger. He said quietly that the truth did not disappear simply because the person who saw it was wearing a janitor's uniform. The room went very still. In the second row of the gallery, Louisa sat beside Serafina. The girl held the rabbit. Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away from her father. He looked at her once and then looked away, because if he had looked any longer he would not have been able to keep his composure, and a man on the witness stand cannot afford to lose his composure. Andrea testified next. She held nothing back. She named the men who had come to her house. She named the dollar amounts. She named the foundation. She did not flinch at the cross-examination because there was nothing left in her to be afraid of. Dr. Kessler took a cooperation agreement and admitted to the payments. Special Agent Chandler walked the jury through the structure of the conspiracy as if she were tracing a circuit. Serafina described what it had felt like to be left alone in a courtroom by a legal team she had paid to defend her. The jury returned its verdict on a Thursday afternoon in early autumn. Leon Granger was convicted on charges including obstruction of justice, witness tampering, evidence manipulation, and fraud against a federal proceeding. 3 other executives were convicted alongside him. Nexus Grid Corporation paid penalties that, by the time the civil settlements were finalized, would total in the high 9 figures, lost its principal government contracts, and entered a period of court-supervised reorganization. Finn left the courthouse without speaking to the press. The cameras followed him across the plaza anyway. This time, no one laughed. That evening in the kitchen of his apartment, Serafina Blake suggested something to him over tea. Not a return to a large firm. A different kind of practice. A small one. Built on the lessons of what had almost happened to her. He told her he would think about it. He had already decided. 1 year later, on a quiet street in Brooklyn, a small storefront opened its doors for the first day of business. The sign was simple. Walker Legal Aid Office. There was no marble in the lobby, because there was no lobby. There was a single desk for an assistant, 2 file cabinets, a small conference room with mismatched chairs, and a wall on which Finn had hung exactly 1 piece of paper. It was the note Louisa had handed him in the staff hallway of the federal courthouse the year before. Daddy tells the truth. The frame had been built by hand. Serafina, with a portion of the settlement she had received, and a percentage of the licensing revenue from the technology she had been accused of stealing, established the Blake Walker Justice Fund. The fund did not exist to make headlines. It existed to pay for the things ordinary people without money never knew they needed until they needed them. Expert witness fees, filing costs, emergency security for witnesses under threat, co-counsel for solo practitioners taking cases against opponents with deeper pockets. The fund was built on the lessons Finn had carried out of the night his apartment was broken into. Most people did not lose because they were wrong. They lost because they could not afford to be right. Serafina continued to run her company, But she had changed. She no longer believed that intelligence and resources were enough to protect anyone. She believed in something quieter now, the slow construction of the conditions under which others would not have to stand alone. Finn had changed too. He had not returned to corporate practice. He had returned to the law for a different reason than he had practiced it the first time. The first time, he had been good at it. The second time, he intended to be useful at it. Louisa, now 7 years old, sometimes came to the office after school. She had a small corner of one desk that was hers, where she did her homework and drew pictures. She had grown up enough to know that her father had once been frightened, and that he had decided to do the right thing anyway. That single piece of memory would shape her quietly for the rest of her life. The relationship between Finn and Serafina had grown slowly. There had been no rush. There had been respect, and then trust, and the kind of partnership that rises from having walked through fire together without burning each other. Whatever it was becoming, it was being allowed to become in its own time, without performance. Late on a Friday afternoon, when Finn was already reaching for his coat to go pick up Louisa, the door opened. A woman in her 60s walked in, carrying a thin folder. She had once worked at a small power station upstate. She had been fired after she reported a safety violation that the company had buried. She had no money for a lawyer, and her old union had told her gently that there was nothing that could be done. She had read about the Walker office in a community newsletter at her church. She asked, almost ashamed, whether she had any chance. Finn looked at her folder. He looked at the clock. Louisa would understand. He set down his coat and pulled out a chair for her. He told her that he did not know yet. He told her that they would start, as he started every case, with the truth. He sat down across from her, opened the folder, and began to read. Outside the window, the light had begun to lower over Brooklyn, gold along the edges of the brick. In a small office, without marble, without prestige, and without spectacle, a quiet kind of justice was returning to work.